In this video vignette, we're going to talk about where does the ATP or the energy source come from in order to have a muscle contraction. So we know we need ATP to interact. So the myosin head can actually kind of ratchet forward and then reset it itself. So actually the first energy source comes from ATP itself that's just stored in the skeletal muscle, but that only lasts for about 6 seconds. So maybe you're doing a sprint, maybe you're lifting weights, or maybe you're out jogging, or whatever your activity is that you're doing, you're going to use ATP that's actually stored in your muscle. But after about 6 seconds, that ATP reserve is used up. So we need to regenerate some ATP. So how does that happen? Well, there's a couple different ways. Some say 3, some say 2. Your book kind of talks about 3 within the context of 2. So the first one's called the creatine phosphate cycle, and that's right here. And you've probably heard of creatine phosphate, or maybe individuals taking creatine as a supplement to their workouts and things like that. Creatine phosphate is just a protein that we have. It's stored in our muscles. Your muscle actually stores a fair amount of it, and so creatine phosphate actually very quickly stores energy and converts ADP back to ATP. So we take the creatine phosphate, which you can see right here, and what happens to that creatine phosphate, we take some creatine that's maybe in our muscles already. When we use up the ATP, that third phosphate breaks off, attaches to creatine, and we get creatine phosphate, and we get ADP left over. Well, now we need to make more ADP. Well, that's easy enough. We're going to take that ADP, we're going to break that phosphate off the creatine, attach it back to ATP to create some more ATP, and we're left with creatine that can go through. So it's just a cycle that occurs over and over. Our muscles store a fair amount of creatine phosphate, and so this reaction usually lasts for about 10 seconds worth of ATP. Okay, so now what? You're at 6 seconds into whatever it is you're doing. You're now 10 seconds into whatever you're doing. So we've used up the ATP that's available. We've used up the creatine phosphate cycle that's available. I'll come back to that one. So now we got to go through cellular respiration. And there's actually 2 parts to cellular respiration. This is where some people kind of break it into a second and third part. Actually, we have the anaerobic process. So that's without oxygen. So this occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. So you can see here's a typical cell here, so a muscle fiber. And so we're going to go through and take glucose and change it into pyruvic acid, and we're going to get out a little bit of ATP in this process, this anaerobic process. So it occurs in the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber, and we make very little ATP. And this whole process is called glycolysis. No oxygen is involved. The problem is if there continues to be no oxygen involved, the pyruvic acid is going to undergo lactic acid fermentation, and we're going to actually make lactic acid. This is what makes your muscles sore, and you get fatigued. So let's say you're in the weight room bench pressing. You aren't going to be able to bench press forever. You bench press, you can't do anymore. You run out of ATP, you got to stop at some point in time. So you get a lactic acid buildup, and so that lactic acid has to be converted back at some point in time, and that's what causes your muscles to be sore. But that's not good enough. Sometimes we need more ATP than that, so we can go through the aerobic phase. So now glucose is still going to go through this glycolysis cycle and become pyruvic acid. But now we're going to actually go into the mitochondria of your muscle cell. The pyruvic acid goes into the mitochondria, and we enter what we call the citric acid cycle. So we're going to break off actually some carbon and oxygen here, specifically take those lists. So that's where the carbon and oxygen comes from the citric acid cycle. And we're going to go through the citric acid cycle, and we're going to make a little bit of ATP, but not very much. And so the big thing that's left over from all this are all these electrons that are from our hydrogen. Remember, glucose is C6H12O6. So the carbon from our glucose, carbon dioxide, the oxygen from our glucose, carbon dioxide. So we got a whole bunch of hydrogens left over. those hydrogens are actually going to lose their electron in the electron transport chain. And so the electron transport chain goes through a series of chemical reactions, and we kind of say it's like a staircase effect. So as this electron goes through these chemical reactions, each time it goes through a chemical reaction, we create some ATP. And we actually create a whole bunch of ATP. This is what produces the most of our ATP, the electron transport chain, as we're going through recycling. Okay. Well, so what happens to this electron when it gets to the end? It hooks back up to the hydrogen. Well, we can't have free hydrogen sitting around. So the hydrogens are going to now attach to oxygen. Remember, we said oxygen is present during this aerobic phase. So the hydrogens hook up with oxygen, and that's how we create water in this whole process. And so we create a little bit of water, we get out some heat. The big thing is we get a whole bunch of ATP. Now, one of the cool things about your muscles, they actually store a little bit of extra oxygen to get this process started. Okay, so in our red blood cell, we have something called hemoglobin, a protein that's shaped kind of like the sickle on a Grim Reaper. Hemoglobin is the protein that actually carries the oxygen. Hemoglobin's in a red blood cell. It carries the oxygen, delivers it. Well, in our muscle fibers, we have a different protein called myoglobin. Remember, myo means muscle. And so the myoglobin is going to actually store some of this extra oxygen so it's available for your mitochondria to make ATP. So there's the three ways that we actually make ATP in our muscles. So what about this thing when you're breathing heavy? You're trying to get in oxygen to your muscles so you can create ATP. Well, you create an oxygen jet, a debt. We've all done a sprint before, so I'll just use that example because it's the easiest. Okay, an oxygen jet is just the amount of oxygen needed by your liver to take that accumulated lactic acid that you've produced to actually convert it back to pruvic acid and then convert that pruvic acid back into glucose. Okay, and so your liver is the part that does it. Well, you create an oxygen debt. So we're sprinting. Let's say it's a 100-meter type sprint. We're going as fast as we can. We get to the end of that. You're breathing heavy because you can't get enough oxygen to your muscle cells to create ATP. So we've created a ton of pruvic acid, and that pruvic acid now makes lactic acid. And so we now need to get that lactic acid, get it to our liver, so our liver can convert it back to glucose, which now we can use the glucose again. And so that's what we call the oxygen jet, if you will. So we're going to convert lactic acid to glucose. In this process, we also need to take ATP. Remember, we're making a little ATP out of this and using some, but we need to resynthesize ATP and creatine phosphate. Remember, we talked about the creatine phosphate. So oxygen is part of that, adding to the oxygen debt. And then we also just need to bring the oxygen levels back to the normal level. I mean, all of your tissues need oxygen, and if we're sending more oxygen to our muscles to contract so we can sprint, that's going to be less oxygen available for other tissues. So now we also have to get oxygen back to the other tissues in our body to make up for that oxygen debt as well. And so if we don't, eventually your muscles are going to fatigue. So what's muscle fatigue? Well, it's just basically the inability for your muscle to even contract. So you've maybe been in a situation, you've been working out or something, maybe you're bench pressing or maybe you're sprinting. You get to a point where you can't go on. You can't sprint anymore. You need to stop. You've created such an oxygen debt, or you're bench pressing or you're squatting or you're doing bicep curls or whatever it is. There comes a point in time you're not going to be able to do anymore because your muscles are fatigued from this oxygen debt. That's the major reason. There's a couple other things that go along with this. Sometimes there's a decreased blood flow and you aren't getting blood flow to the muscles in order for them to contract. Sometimes there's an ion imbalance. We haven't spent a ton of time yet talking about sodium potassium. We'll get to that in a little bit, but if your ion imbalances, the sodium ion, the potassium ion, aren't right, on opposite sides of the sarcolemma, now your muscle also isn't going to contract. Or if there's too much lactic acid, and that happens in the sprinting or in a weight room type workout because it's not an aerobic type exercise. So you get a whole bunch of lactic acid, and that lactic acid just causes your muscle to cramp up and shut down. It's not going to contract anymore because it's cramped. It's going to involuntarily contract and stay contracted. So that would be a cramp. It's going to be a sustained contract. A muscle spasm would be due to a couple of these, maybe an imbalance in ions, oxygen shortage, where the muscle is going to contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax, and that would be a spasm type situation. And for the most part, usually this is a physiological situation. Things going wrong inside the muscle cell itself, from the ion imbalance to blood flow to decreased oxygen, um, and build or an excess buildup of lactic acid. But once in a while, it's a psychological process as we use that energy, and we're unwilling to go any further. And this is what happens when we have athletes that sort of quote unquote hit the wall. Maybe you've seen a marathon runner get to the point where maybe they can physiologically go on, but psychologically they shut down. They can't tolerate the fatigue that their body's going through, and they just shut down. Um, Lastly, to the heat production of your muscles. Heat's a byproduct of the cellular respiration, and we need to get that heat away from your muscle cells, because remember, we need to maintain 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so since your muscles are contracting, they're generating all this heat, and our blood vessels need to carry that away. So the blood transports that throughout our body core to the surface of our skin, and then we go through all those things that we talked about with our skin as far as radiating, conducting, or even starting that sweating process and that evaporation of the sweat off our skin to cool our body.